Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here, not only to meet so many old friends, colleagues from my political life or academic life, but especially to see such a packed audience of young people. Of course, the future belongs to them, and our task is to try to, give some ideas to them, perhaps drawn from our life experience, and political and other experience. Well, now you are going to hear another version, to some degree, of the previous talk, which was done from a professional economist, if I suppose that his background is that. And now you will hear a story from a historian. Well, besides, I am not a social or economic historian, let alone an economist. I'm a political historian mainly, and my qualifications to speak here go back, on the one hand, to 20-year experience in public life, political life, after the great changes, but also being an expert and a professional in 20th century history, and also somebody who had lived under communism, and I think somebody who understands communism and also its afterlife. Well, as we all know, I will say a few words, first of all, about the ups and downs of capitalism in Hungary and in general in Central Europe. Well, as we all know, the Industrial Revolution in the Western world introduced a kind of great improvement in material life, in moral life, in moral attitudes, and also in health, in public health, longer life expectancy. So it was a promising kind of phenomenon. But on the other hand, we can see that capitalism, the story of capitalism, went hand in hand with the political changes which got involved more and more people in the political process, culminating in universal suffrage and, modern representative democracy. All that was encompassed in the idea of progress and optimism. And going back to 100 years, early 20th century, we saw even more general conviction about, if you like, capitalism, about the modern world, although questions already started to arise. But by that time, the capitalist system came to dominate not only the so-called advanced world, the Western world, but penetrated all the continents and spread to the remotest corner of the world. The very serious shortcomings and excesses of the capitalist system were gradually corrected, thanks to such critical authors like Saint-Simon in France, Proudhon, and then Marx, and theorists, especially English, Locke, and many other people. And also the political movements like social democracy, arising particularly in the late 19th century, and Christian socialism. So all that held out the hope that really the world was going endlessly to a kind of better future. Ramsay MacDonald, the first British Labour Prime Minister, expressed it in an interesting sentence, said that the world is moving up and up and up, and on and on and on. I think it's a very apt kind of summary of that optimism. Even the less advanced part of the world, first of all, Central and Eastern Europe and other continents, came to believe that capitalism combined with this growing participatory democracy will make the world a much better place. And they will, the less advanced countries will be able to catch up with the advanced world. Well, of course, the First World War, and even more the Great Depression, shattered that rosy, optimistic view. Both international and national socialism, that is Hitler and Stalin, rejected, of course, capitalism, at least in words, both, unfortunately, had substantial following. In the West, mainly among intellectuals, and on a massive scale in the less advanced part of Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, or in general in the less advanced countries or underdeveloped regions of the world. Anyhow, versions of these two versions of socialism, if I can say about Nazism or about communism that it was socialism in name, certainly very different from the noble but utopistic ideas of the early socialists. So they really promised and offered a kind of very rapid way to be a prosperous country. Well, the Second World War, of course, discredited Nazism, and somewhat later, the Soviet practice in Central Europe and, of course, in the Soviet Union itself, discredited communism. Starting with the 1950s, Western prosperity revived belief in capitalism, now called the market economy. Behind the Iron Curtain, it was admired for its abundance of goods, which were not available in the East, in the communist world, where, of course, everything was always in short supply. I would like now to say a few words about how communism came to an end and how that led to an increasing belief, both in Hungary and in all the communist-dominated countries, in a belief in capitalism, in the market economy. Well, inside the Soviet bloc, in the 1970s and 1980s, there were very few people who still believed what Nikita Khrushchev, a former Soviet leader, had promised in the early 1960s, namely that Moscow type of socialism would overtake and bury Western capitalism. The mood was increasingly bad in this communist world, but Hungary, my country, offered some hope. It was a relatively good place to live, probably the best in the communist camp, mainly thanks to our 1956 revolution, which, though brutally suppressed by the intervention of the Soviet Union, but earned a kind of respect in Moscow. Today, we can see how fateful conclusions Moscow's Hungarian puppet, János Kádár, drew from the 56 revolution. He thought the Hungarians must first be brutally punished. Yes, hundreds of people were executed after the revolution, mainly workers and very simple, ordinary people. But after that, the Hungarian society was really literally bribed to be servile, self-seeking, egotist, unscrupulous, coward, cynical, and credulous, and I can add many words, lacking also compassion and any sense of solidarity. I think it was also similar in the communist world, but perhaps more marked in my own country. My friends and I, and many people in Hungary, of course, condemned that Kádár policy, and we were never really pleased with the so-called goulash communism, or with the image of Hungary as the so-called jolliest barrack in the communist bloc. The system became totally discredited by the end of the 1980s, not so much on account of its lack of democracy and dictatorial nature, which was, of course, still there, but because it failed to give a better life. And instead of catching up with the West, the gap between the advanced European and West American world and our world was growing. I always maintain, or at least looking back to these 20 years, that prosperity was the best weapon of the West during the Cold War. Well, we know that Gorbachev tried to save the system, not to overthrow it. He wanted to introduce reform to be able to make it more competitive and to be able to keep up the armament race and so on. But that effort only sped up its decline. But I always add that despite the role of Reagan, the role of Gorbachev, perhaps the role of Chancellor Kohl, Mrs. Thatcher, without the people, without primarily the Poles and the Hungarians, who were the first to challenge the one-party state, so, and of course Solidarność role and the role of John Paul II, the Pope, and without the silent oppositions of the communist countries, including East Germany, becoming more and more vociferous, the system may have survived for many years or even for decades. Yes, in Hungary and in Poland also in the late 80s appeared a group of people very often called the reformist communists or reform communists. Well, they were not idealist people who just came to see the light. They were rather opportunist people who realized that communism or their communism had reached the end of the road, and that perhaps they too may do better financially, economically, in a capitalist system. By the end of the 1980s, very few people, in my country at least, had any illusions about communism. Many, even Communist Party members, learned Western languages. Many acquired Western connections, capitalist friends. And even more people in the summer of 1989 jumped on the bandwagon of reform. A Hungarian author, well known in Germany too, Péter Eszterházy, coined a wonderful phrase about the many turncoats. I quote him, "There is rush hour traffic on the road to Damascus." So how people changed their mantle. This was unexpected for the public, and there was a great relief and a kind of gratitude felt for the communist leaders, in Hungary at least the last generation, to have become so reasonable to be ready to surrender the monopoly of power peacefully. At that time, in the at the end of 1989 and early 90s, so when the wall fell, and when the first free elections were held all over the former communist world, I think nowhere was there any strong sense for revenge, the desire to punish people. Yes, there was anger only against the people who resisted changes, like the dreaded dictator of Romania, Ceausescu. Now, how the miracle happened, I don't think that I have to speak now. Anyhow, the 20th anniversary gave a lot of opportunity even for young people like here to recall or to learn how unexpectedly all the communist dominoes fell. But there was a joke in Hungary. In all the communist countries, there were many jokes making life more bearable. And one joke was following that, what is worse than communism? What comes after that? Obviously, it was a kind of premonition that the transition will not be without very serious pains. But of course, people were not aware of that, although the new politicians like myself did not hide that the transition would be a very difficult process. I recall that actually recently I came across a book by a German author, Birgit Müller's book entitled Disenchantment with Market Economics, East Germans and Western Capitalism. It was published in English in 2007. And it shows how people reacted to the breakdown of the planned economy at their workplaces in East Berlin immediately after the fall of the wall. In Hungary and throughout the former communist world, people had similar hopes and illusions about the Western world, and particularly about the consumer society. While the inhabitants of East Berlin knew their Western counterpart only from television and the verbal accounts of relatives and visitors, Hungarians and also Poles were given the possibility to request an exit visa for traveling in Western Europe in the 1970s, 1980s. And they had some superficial impression of Western prosperity, which certainly influenced their decision to be happy to quit communism. But unless somebody showed open opposition to the communist system in Hungary, the permission was usually granted once in every 2 or 3 years. And they could even buy a modest amount of foreign currency at the official relatively low price. I emphasize this because I think it helps to explain on the one hand why Hungary and Poland were the first to push for radical changes, but also that these two countries and the population were really exposed to this superficial element of prosperity. Kärtnerstrasse in Vienna, and the shop windows, the department stores. Yes, just my friend from Romania knows very well that that was the big attraction, more powerful than the quest for democracy. Well, I think communism is not unknown in this audience, but it is increasingly a matter of the past. And I think I have to explain briefly a few things. That on the one hand, how the former communists were quite successful, not only transforming themselves into democrats, but also transforming themselves into capitalists. But, and that will be really a kind of important message for me in this talk, that post-1990 capitalism in Hungary is very much linked to the former communists, and with their conduct, they compromised capitalism itself in the eyes of the public. And similar tendencies did appear in other former communist-dominated countries too, but especially strong they were in Russia and Ukraine. So the communist leadership was heavily defeated, thoroughly defeated, practically in all the former communist countries in the first free elections in the 1990s. And in Hungary, I think it was more noticeable, or perhaps actually it was not so much noticed, but what happened was that the former communists ousted, so to say, from political life, although not legally, and actually they scored 10% at the 1990 first election, which was, of course, a very modest showing. They went into kind of business. And I personally, as foreign minister, was very happy when an old communist diplomat voluntarily left his or her job and went into business, because they were not so successful, not very hardworking as diplomats. But what was more important, really, that whereas the new political elite, whether in Czechoslovakia or in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania it was a little bit different story, because that political transformation came a little bit later, I think, in 1996 with the election of a real non-communist President Constantinescu. But anyhow, so in all these countries, privatization was on the agenda, and it was essential. Well, of course, it was communism which confiscated property without any compensation. But we really, returning to capitalism, returning to a market economy, well, ownership had to be clarified. And, well, in some countries, there was partial reprivatization, like in Czechoslovakia, buildings, factories were returned to previous owners or their descendants. But in other countries like Hungary, it was found impossible, and there was only a compensation for whatever you lost through communism and nationalization. But so it meant that it was quite easy to turn state assets, nationalized assets, into private property. And whereas on the one hand we wanted to sell it to the highest bidder, and mainly to Western companies, it very often happened that there was not much enthusiasm to buy factories which were not competitive with the West. Well, I think people in East Germany, former East Germany, know very well this story, and you have still the residue of that process. But so at a low price, it was possible for former communist bigwigs and their families also to use loans from friends who were running the banks to buy very cheaply state assets. I think this process was especially noticeable in the former Soviet Union, and that is how the so-called oligarchs became so rich and powerful. So anyhow, the important aspect of this whole story is that, and it is worth really writing, worth reading about, worth studies, that many former communists became quite rich in this new capitalist world, and this is one element of the story. Then comes the other question, the disappointment in the changes. Well, as I told you already, people were very happy with dictatorship gone, with the system of informers gone. But primarily they wanted prosperity and hoped that by changing the political system, changing the laws and the constitution, prosperity will come, at least a modest version of it, and in a few years' time they will be members of the European community, the European Union, and slowly but steadily, also thanks to the policy of compensation funds and structural funds, these countries will be really just like, they will follow the example of Spain, Portugal, Greece, who after dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, turned to democracies and to quite prosperous countries. The non-communist governments, I think the first governments, well, did the right things mainly. Sometimes it was called the shock therapy, like in Poland. But we hardly noticed how the former communists consolidated their hold on the economy. Now comes the story of these disappointments, the first wave. I have two quotations for that. One is from Aristotle. It is easier to be a slave than to be a free man. At first it is shocking, but we know even from modern slavery in America, North America, that yes, it is not good to be a slave, but you are being looked after if you have a good master and so on. So yes, communism was a version of slavery, but it provided, well, the basic necessities for everyone. Well, transportation, rent was very cheap, very low. Basic food items were also. So what I like to, how I like to describe it, and this is the second quotation, it is really immodestly from me, very little was available in the communist period, but that little was affordable. Now, with the changes, everything became available, but very little was affordable. And that, I think that is the crux of the matter. So people are unhappy, were unhappy under communism, even economically, but everybody appeared to be poor, and some other communist countries even looked poorer, so you could look down upon them. So that was something which people accepted, and that's especially the case in Hungary, that, and the communist leaders always said, oh, look at Poland, they are striky because they are lazy, and you just keep on working and you will have a little better life every day. So that was something which was very easy to swallow. And with the changes, well, some people became conspicuously rich, new cars appeared on the street, and many people, on the other hand, lost their jobs, which was also a safe thing earlier. Everybody had to have a job. It was a punishable crime not to have a job. And now, of course, in my own country, well, a substantial percentage of the workplace was laid off and lived on a modest benefit, social benefit, unemployment benefit. So even before the present crisis, so the first few years after 1990 were really hard for many people, and they could simply, they not could, but they envied those who profited from the changes. They also envied the politicians who were not the biggest beneficiaries of the system, but mainly the new business people, people who were connected to the multinational Western companies who, after all, did buy up many of the assets in all these countries. And people also started to develop a longing for the past, not only for this economic safe life, but yes, there was free education, free health care. Yes, it was low quality, and people were always complaining about the long lines they had to spend in consulting rooms of the physicians and so on. And also people had to bribe from the nurses to the doctors to have an adequate kind of service. But it was still nominally free. And so with the new system gradually making everything more and more expensive, it was also annoying. So it was not strange that practically in all the former communist countries, after the first three elections, the next elections were won by the former communists. Of course, they were no longer called communists, but social democrats, and they were successful usually in preventing genuine old social democrats or people who were not coming from a communist background. They prevented them, and so the Western social democracy needed allies in Central and Eastern Europe. So after some hesitations, they endorsed the so-called post-communists. And starting in Lithuania and in Poland, and followed by Hungary, so in 1993, 1994, everywhere the former communists came back to office at free elections, which certainly in 1990 nobody would have predicted, including themselves. Yes, very soon it turned out that whatever people expected from them cannot be fulfilled. A friend of mine said at that time that, yes, Hungarians thought that bread would be again something like 3.60 forints per kilo, but they did not realize that it would be really 3.60, but not in forints, but in dollars. So that was the second disappointment, that yes, it was not simply enough to change the government and to bring back the former communists. Life would not be different. And actually, I think, again, what is a more or less general pattern is that the former communists, now socialists, were behaving like true capitalists, and actually they were quite clever in the financial world, in getting high jobs in the multinational companies, partly through the connections which they built in the last years of communism. So they were not classical capitalists who established factories giving jobs to millions of people, but in other ways they really followed what Karl Marx once described as the primary accumulation of capital, when using rather dirty methods, some people enriched themselves. I think there is a lot of similarity between the new rich in the former communist world and the early 19th century capitalist world. The majority of the 10.5 million Hungarian citizens, so to say proletarianized, during 45 years of communism, resented that while the traditional shortage of goods was over, affluence spread only to a small section of the population. Under communism, people learned, or at least thought, that life was a zero-sum game. One person's gain was seen in direct correlation with another person's loss. And so they believed that the arrival of the new rich meant that they would have become poor or poorer. Well, as I told you anyhow, that by the end of the 1990s, it turned out that returning to the old communist leadership and a younger echelon would not make things better. And so the third elections were usually again won by non-communists, civic party, the Fidesz civic party in Hungary, and anyhow democratic parties in all the communist world. But coinciding with the second half of the 90s and early the 21st century, irrespective of the political composition of the governments, we could see that after all there were successes and good results. So there is an apparent success story in those years, and I will just quote a few Western statements showing that. Perhaps I will cut it short because I will not be able to prove how the loss of faith happened. But, well, for example, the Financial Times, an article, or the Washington Post in 2006, Central Europe appears to be enjoying a golden age. Its countries hold NATO and European Union club cards. Billions of euros in EU funds are flowing in. Economies in the region are fast expanding. Latvian growth rates outpace China's, and all the other countries are head and shoulders above Eurozone levels. Central Europeans are richer than ever, buying DVD players, plasma televisions, and new homes. Every element is in place for a success story. That was from the Financial Times. From The Economist, the best performing economies are setting quite a pace. Estonia and Latvia posted 10% GDP growth in 2005, reminiscence of Asia's tigers. The question now is whether the new Europeans can keep it up and catch the richer half of their continent. Few worry about external shocks, though Hungary, with its big current account and budget deficit, looks vulnerable. Finally, no, I leave that out. So I mentioned the success story, and yes, I think people started to have now again a faith that perhaps it would take a longer time than expected and hoped for, but with the new investment, with the very visible improvements in transportation, construction of motorways, and of course many new buildings or old buildings being destroyed. So after all, it was good to change, to switch from communism and the command economy to a capitalist market economy. But then came the blow, the great blow, the financial crisis, the recent financial crisis. In fact, even before it hit Hungary and before it hit the world, we could see in my own country, Hungary, and now we see no longer a kind of common general pattern, that in 2002, the former Communist or the Socialist Party unexpectedly won the election. And I don't want to sound partisan, and I am not a member of any political party now in Hungary, but their performance was extremely poor, dismal, and my country, which was often called the frontrunner or one of the frontrunners, the Visegrad 3, later the Visegrad 4, were expected to be the first not only in NATO but also in the European Union. But the European Union waited for a long time. We had a quite long engagement period. But finally, in 2004, as you all know, there was this big bang and growth. Whereas all the countries, former communist countries, really started to show impressive results. I quoted some. Not in Hungary. And by the mid-2000, so the first decade of the 21st century, saw Hungary going down and down. And, well, that is obviously the responsibility of the current government. Well, it was especially due to large-scale corruption, which is sadly to be found all over the former communist world, or actually beyond the communist world too, but was particularly striking. And I always maintain that this very strong kind of preoccupation with a consumer society, with all the goodies, with the cars, with the possibility to travel and to spend your vacation in the most exotic places. That explains partly the rise of crime, the rise of corruption, because, yes, by ordinary work, by ordinary salaries, wages, these are not affordable. But if in some way, really, bending the law, and really by criminal actions, you can get a lot of money, then you enjoy all these things which are quite common in the Western world. So that explains all the golden handshakes, which were a particular reason for scandals in the last year in Hungary when became exposed. And, I'm afraid that this last few years, when capitalism in Hungary was no longer successful, and it was conducted by people who, no matter what their background, political background was, really professed themselves to be free market capitalists. believing in really all that kind of statements and all the notions put forward by leading economists of the late 19th and late 20th century and early 21st century. So Hungarian average people started to put the blame for their miseries or for difficulties partly on the leaders, but also on the very system of present-day capitalism, which is usually called globalization. So just an example of that. Actually, the media, which is sometimes called the right of center media, there's an increase in populist demands, criticism directed at the World Bank, the IMF, the US, and globalization in general. The Economist, in a recent article, put Hungary out of 42 advanced countries to be the lowest but one performance for the coming year. Minus 1% growth is expected after 7% minus growth rate last year. Industrial production in Hungary fell by 9% last year, while inflation exceeded 5%, the highest in the EU, whereas Poland is expected to grow by 2%, the Czech Republic by 1%. I must confess that I am a bit reluctant to say such things because as a politician, as an ambassador, I think I had good reason to speak good about my country, about good results, and there were good results. And now I simply cannot speak about, well, promising or good results. So nobody can question that the main responsibility for the poor showing rests with the performance and policies of the socialist-led governments of the last 8 years. But a large section of Hungary's population, prompted by several media organs and the people who appear there, believes that capitalism, at least its current version, and its leading exponents are to blame. A recent article in the daily Magyar Nemzet, which is a center-right paper, stated that the aim of the foreign investors was only to take over the home market, first in small retail trade and in the agricultural market, and that is the major cause of the high, over 10% unemployment rate in Hungary. While shops and enterprises owned by Hungarians keep their profits and invest them, the multinationals largely take the profit out of the country, the paper writes. They also delay their payments, often by 180 days. At the same time, they enjoy tax holidays and government subsidies. And the conclusion of the article was, what is needed is the protection of the home market and ending the discrimination against home companies. Well, I just wanted to show in kind of summary the legacy of communism, which I actually already explained, how the transition, the shock therapy worked or more or less worked, what we had to do, new constitutions, privatization, GDP at first fell, and there was high unemployment, but then the achievements, not only political achievements, human rights achievements, but also growing productivity and so on. Also expanding education, especially at the university level, but unfortunately now it means many jobless graduates. Well, integration in Western Europe was successful, especially with EU membership and causes of the disillusionment. I also mentioned, but as Olli Rehn, EU Commission for Enlargement, said, many doomsday scenarios preceded the Eastern enlargement, none of which has materialized. So I already mentioned many of the dissatisfaction symbols. Of course, even in the European Union, well, the new members are not really equal, so especially agricultural subsidies are considerably lower, and that makes it very hard for the agricultural sector to compete with subsidized products of the old members. Well, new jobs and wealth started to come, unevenly distributed. I mentioned growing crime, that I mentioned the success story, so we can skip it. and now the impact of the financial crisis. As you can see very well and know very well, growth stopped or slowed down considerably. Multinational companies are moving out. Credit became very expensive. Foreign currency loans, especially, which many people irresponsibly raised. Austerity programs raising taxes. More governments are more ready to do that than reducing spending. And a few graphs from a recent poll taken by the Pew Research Center. I suppose quite a few of you are familiar with that. And it shows really, on the one hand, I hope it is seen well, especially the red line is the Hungarian one. So the pattern is quite similar, as you know, and you can see. But what is more important for my story, although that is the basic explanation, is that approval. So what are the attitudes of people? And you can see that approval of change to democracy, comparing 1991 and 2009, well, there is a fall everywhere, but it is not very substantial. Although in Hungary and in Lithuania, where the economic performance is the worst, even democracy is to some degree blamed for that. But what is really important and stunning, regime change is not much appreciated. Approval of change to capitalism. Again, comparing figures in 1991. You can see that in the former East Germany, there is not much change. You can look at the change minus how many points. But Bulgaria, we heard the story, 20% loss of confidence or approval rate, and Lithuania, another poor performing country, 22, and Hungary is unfortunately, very sadly, is heading. In 1991, there were very high approval rate for capitalism, and now it is very low, the lowest. Disenchantment with the present system. Are people worse off today than under communism? Which is, of course, a very unrealistic kind of feeling, but it is still a feeling which exists. So you can see, again, Hungary, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Lithuania. So this is the kind of list of countries, how much they are disillusioned or disenchantment. Democratic values are still mostly accepted, and that is very important and very encouraging. And you can see that, well, actually in that, Hungary is still quite high, and I'm happy to say that. Well, there are many dangers facing Europe, but it is not so much of part of my own story. There's nationalism, populism, extremism. The Western media is very often sensational and is overdoing the changes and the existing problems. But, of course, energy dependence is a very serious danger. Where these are the pipelines and then potential pipelines, which is, again, not exactly our stories. Conflicts about or over national minorities is a serious issue, but, again, this is not part of our story. But basically, before I try to end up with some optimism, moderate optimism, I think we find something quite interesting, namely that the Central European critics of globalization, that is present-day capitalism, were until recently considered to be kind of neo-Marxists, as many of their sentences sounded like taken from the old Marxist political economy textbooks. But with the international financial crisis, at least some of their views received credibility, as shown by the recent article from the Financial Times. And if you permit, well, I will quote only a part of it. So it says that, I quote, "The global financial crisis has changed all that. At this year's Davos, the Western delegates seemed depressed, defensive, or even mildly deranged, in the case of Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president. After listening to Mr. Sarkozy's passionate attack on financial capitalism, one Russian participant was overheard saying that he had found the experience pleasantly nostalgic. He remembered hearing many similar speeches in the Soviet Union. Well, with all the above facts and perceptions, I am not pessimistic about the future, whether in Central Europe in general and in Hungary in particular, not even about the popularity of capitalism once its excesses in Hungary are brought under control. After all, neither the politics nor the economics of communism, the old command economy, has any chance to return. The formalities of democracy are not endangered. And I showed you that actually people still have a belief in democracy. But besides honest government, we also need a successful market economy, ending the present-day poverty and bringing the promise of prosperity closer. And my hope is really looking at Germany after the Second World War. Germany unexpectedly, very quickly became a prosperous country, largely thanks to its, of course, diligent and well-educated people, and also to what was called the social market economy. The very principle, the very policy was attempted and introduced in Hungary in 1990. We did not have enough time, and well, there were new governments who did not follow that pattern. So with the elections coming very soon in April in Hungary, there is a strong likelihood that we will have a new government, a non-communist government dedicated to growth, dedicated to eradicating corruption, and dedicated to the social market economy, which will be more difficult now, I'm afraid, than it was in 1990, because then the whole world really supported the former communist countries and showed sympathy for that. Now I see, of course, there are so many other problems, not only in Central Europe, but all over the world. So it is up to our countries, up to our elections, up to our electorate to introduce new policies. And so I do hope that, well, actually I'm convinced that there is no alternative to the present capitalism, but it must put its house into order first for now. And of course, we must follow, well, these measures, which unfortunately do not come quickly enough. And the expectations that the crisis will introduce substantially new policies in the advanced countries has not materialized so far. But the latest figures of the last 2 days may again wake up people, and well, we stand or fall together, but I hope that we will stand. Thank you.